What's up? I'm Troubleshoot. In this quick guide, I'll be showing you how to optimize Horizon Forbidden West for the best performance on PC. In the description down below, you'll find even more guides for tons more performance on your system, showing you how to optimize Windows, your graphics card settings, and anything else that may be useful. This video is only going to cover the in-game settings, so let's get straight into it. Just to keep things spoiler-free, I've started a brand new game here, just to give you an idea of what settings you should pick from the default. Currently, I'm getting around 60 FPS, which is pretty good, but of course I'm playing at 2K on a 3080 Ti, so a higher end system with a better looking display. Let's go ahead and pause the game so we can open up our settings, head across to the display tab, and this is where we'll start. First of all, windowed mode should be set to full screen, display resolution should match your display, or at least be compatible. That way, there'll be less blur, and you're not creating pixels you're not actually looking at. Aspect ratio is your preference, as well as cinematic letterboxing. Then refresh rate should match your monitor, and if it's locked off, that's fine. VSync should definitely be turned off unless you're getting screen tearing where the top and bottom half don't seem to match up. Then for NVIDIA graphics cards, if you have the NVIDIA Reflex low latency option, enabling this should give you better performance and input latency when you're GPU limited. Otherwise, if you're CPU limited, which you're likely not going to be, you'll need to choose on plus boost. So I'll choose on here. Dynamic range is your preference and should work with your monitor. If you have HDR available, you can enable it in here. It shouldn't affect your performance all that much. Colorblind mode, once again, your preference. Dynamic resolution scaling should be turned off. Now we can manually choose what kind of upscaling and anti-aliasing we're using. If you don't want to use upscaling at all, I'd recommend using TAA, anti-aliasing, or DLAA. These options look the best, but if you crank it down to SMAA or even off, things just look not that good at all. Super jagged and sharp edges, so TAA or DLAA here for a better looking experience. However, if you're looking for performance, you won't be using anti-aliasing at all. Instead, you'll be using upscaling. I'd highly recommend using upscaling as you'll get pretty much just as good visual quality with probably almost double your performance. DLSS is what you should choose if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, but FSR2 works on any GPU, AMD, NVIDIA, etc. What I've noticed is that DLSS seems to shimmer a bit less, and personally I'll be choosing this, but FSR is still a really good option. Upscale quality should be set to quality for the least visual impact while giving you a good boost in performance. If you finish this optimization guide and you want even more performance, you can come back here and crank this down to balanced or even performance on lower end systems, but it will greatly affect visual quality. So quality is what you want to choose here. Then DLSS frame generation. If you have an RTX 40 series graphics card, you'll be able to enable this. I don't, so unfortunately I can't use this. Essentially, this will generate interpolated frames using AI in between real frames, meaning that you get probably double your FPS. It'll take you from 60 to 120, etc. This is huge, but I don't have access to it. Then, if you're using FSR or XeSS, unfortunately, you won't have access to frame generation anyway. It seems to only be DLSS frame generation rather than FSR3 frame generation, so maybe in the future we'll get this option or modders will add it in. Alright, we'll apply the settings and head across to the graphics tab where we can get the majority of our performance. Starting at the very top, preset, you should move between these to see what kind of visual impact each option gives you, and of course pick it based on what kind of hardware you have in your system. If you know that you have super underpowered hardware, set it to very low and work your way up, or if you have a relatively good PC, set it to medium and work your way up or down. First of all, texture quality. This depends on how much VRAM your system has, and if you have a graphics card with around 4 gigs of VRAM, medium is a good option for you. Anything less, select low. However, if your GPU's got more than 4 gigs of VRAM, say 6 gigs, you'll probably be able to choose high, and anything above 6, very high. I'd recommend choosing high here as it gives you the best visual fidelity with a good impact in performance. Very high doesn't seem to be doing too much, but it does cost more VRAM and a handful of performance, so high is good here. Then anisotropic filtering for textures. This has barely any impact here between 16x and off or trilinear. You can see a bit of movement on the rock down to the left of my character here. As I switch between 16x and trilinear, this has almost no impact in performance, so leaving this on 8 or 16x is probably fine. Then shadow quality. This has a massive impact on how the game looks, but it's also a very expensive quality. Very low and low seem to get rid of a ton of different shadows. However, medium adds the majority of them back with good quality. High and very high seem to do not too much to shadows, so medium's where I'd be leaving this for the good looking shadows and good performance. Anything higher isn't doing that much. Then screen space shadows is good to have on, and it has a very tiny performance impact. I'd recommend just leaving it on for a better looking game. Ambient occlusion adds a ton more depth to the scene, as you can see between off and SSAO. I definitely recommend leaving it on pretty much no matter the performance cost, as it adds just so much extra visual information. Then screen space reflections, this mostly has to do with water, and it has a tiny impact between off, high, and low. I'd recommend just choosing high here as it looks the best, and there's practically no performance impact. Level of detail affects how close objects need to be to you in order to render in-game. If I were to look a little bit over here, where you can see it from the options menu, you'll see that if I change it from low to medium, there's a couple more trees that appear, and there's higher quality objects right in front of us. If I set it to high and even very high, there's very little difference between these, except for maybe a few leaves on nearby trees. But on medium to low, there's a huge amount of detail difference, and I'd recommend leaving this on low at lowest. This also has a good pop-in distance, so if you're running around, trees and things won't just suddenly appear as they would on low or even very low. This of course depends on your performance and has a very small impact on performance, so medium's where I'd leave it. Hair quality only affects your character, it doesn't seem to affect anything else, and the impact is very negligible. I'd leave it on high as there's practically no FPS difference, and it adds just a bit more visual information, improving how the game looks. Crowd quantity mainly affects your CPU, and of course in this game you're probably going to be GPU limited anyway, so moving this up to high adds a couple more characters, makes them look a bit better, and that's where I'd leave it. That's it. Terrain quality, the lowest I would go here is medium. Anything below this makes the ground look a little bit worse, and anything above this adds very little information for a medium FPS impact, so medium is where I'd leave it. Water quality, setting this to high has almost no performance impact, and it adds better water physics, improving your gameplay experience when swimming around, so I'd highly recommend having this turned on. Having it off has almost no performance impact or FPS gain, and it just sort of takes away from the immersiveness. Cloud quality, medium and low look about the same, but the jump between high and medium, which you can't really see here, adds a bit more fog and more depth to the scene. I'd recommend having it on high, probably at lowest. Translucency quality has almost no impact on performance, and having it enabled results in an ever so slightly better looking image, so I'd say leave it on high res. Then parallax occlusion mapping is once again extremely subtle between on and off, and not really used in a lot of places. You can see a little bit of movement on the tree next to me, but as for performance, I'd recommend just leaving it off as it has such a tiny impact. Then field of view is entirely your preference, set this to what you want and leave it. The performance gain and loss isn't really worth worrying about. If we have it on the higher end, rendering more things, we're getting around 93, 92 FPS, and of course lowering it down to the default, we're getting 107-ish FPS, and cropping it even further, 110-ish. So while it does have a performance impact, this really shouldn't affect what you have chosen, as it's really down to your preference and what you feel like. Depth of field has almost no difference between high and off, so I'd recommend just leaving it on high. Bloom adds a bit of extra lighting effect to the game. I'd recommend keeping it on, almost no performance impact, and the same goes for most of these options after this point. Motion blur strength is your preference. I'd personally turn it down just a little bit. Sharpness, once again your preference, and it'll mainly affect how your game looks. If you're using something like a DLSS or FSR, this is where the sharpness option is. 5 is a good midpoint, that's probably where I'd leave it, if not making it a tiny bit softer at 4 or even 3. Lens flares, vignette, radial blur, and chromatic aberration are all just personal taste. They all add a little bit to the game, but what you want to have them set to is entirely your preference. I'll just be leaving everything on. That's it. We haven't really changed all that much, except for lowering shadow quality, level of detail, and terrain quality, as these seem to have a relatively big impact on performance. If we back out of here and back into the game, you'll see that we're now sitting at 110-ish FPS, which is actually a good improvement from where we were when we started. And of course, the game looks even better. So overall, we gained quite a bit by following through this very simple optimization guide. The next thing I'd recommend having a look at is the modding community, as there's a couple of good ideas that already exist, and of course, in the future there'll be even more. What do I mean? Well, having a look at Nexus mods, for example, for Horizon Forbidden West, sorting by endorsements, you can see we have a No More Yellow Tint mod, which essentially gets rid of the yellow tint that's visible all over the game. If this is something that you'd like, you can go ahead and download this mod. We also have the FSR 3 frame generation mod, but this seems to, at this point, only work for RTX graphics cards, and it'll replace the DLSS frame generation with FSR frame generation. The same goes for a DLSS update. It pushes the built-in 3.5 to version 6. There's a very small difference here, mostly just in DLSS quality, but whether you choose to have it on or off is your preference, and of course, whether you'd like to download mods such as this. But that just goes to show what things are possible when it comes to modifying this engine. You can also use something like ReShade to get a slightly different color grading and general effects over the scene. For example, this photorealistic one adds a bit more color and is something that you may like. For example, Vanilla versus ReShade 1. As you can see, there's a small difference between them. It makes it look a little bit more cinematic. But if you were to install something like ReShade, there's thousands of different packs that you could download and have a look between, and you can even customize it pretty much infinitely. I won't be covering ReShade here, as there's thousands of guides that exist already, and there's tons and tons of presets here that you can have a look at. The final thing that I would recommend is giving the HFW Frame Generator Enabler mod a look, as it'll enable frame generation for GPUs that weren't officially supported. If you'd like to know how to set this up so you can get frame generation working if you're not running an RTX 30 series graphics card, then check the description down below, as that will quite literally double your FPS, but you'll need a good FPS to start with for the game to not feel laggy and stuttery. Anyways, that's really it. So hopefully you found this video useful. Thank you for watching. My name's been Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao.